Good afternoon, everybody. We are in the prayer room at Aldersgate and going to be looking at Good Friday. And let me just remind you of where we've come at this point. Yesterday we celebrated and remembered Jesus washing the feet of the disciples and understanding what true servanthood looks like, or what the book said love looks like. Then we went to the Passover meal and listened as Jesus changed the words and talked about what was coming. Talked about his body being broken and his blood being shed. And now we move into the darkest day, as you'll hear a little bit later on. And as we progress through this final day in the life of Jesus on earth, we're going to have some readings, read from Easter Love Letters from God, 3 chapters today. And as we progress through each of the chapters and each of the segments of the end of Jesus' life, I'll be extinguishing a candle with each piece until all that's left is the Christ candle here at the center. And then at the end, I'll remove that and put it into what would be like a tomb. And you'll hear 3 words at the end. So as we begin, what I ask of you is to take a moment and just prepare yourself. Prepare your hearts, prepare your minds. And if you can, go back and try and be a part of each one of these pieces, these 7 pieces of the life and the end of the life of Jesus on earth. Let's take a moment in silence as we prepare to begin. From Easter Love Letters from God. Darkness fell as the disciples followed Jesus out into the night. Jesus walked through the quiet streets toward the Garden of Gethsemane. He wanted to pray. The moon shone through the olive trees as Jesus knelt down. The garden, it was gloomy, and all was still. "Father, are you there?" Jesus said quietly. "Do I have to die? Is there any other way that we can teach the world about heaven or about you?" There was no reply. Jesus sobbed. He didn't want to die, but he trusted God. And even though he felt absolutely alone, he knew that God was with him. He was ready. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps, and they broke the silence of the night. Angry shouts filled the air. Jesus looked up through his tears, and shadowy figures came toward him, torches flickering in the darkness. The soldiers were there to take him away. Jesus stood up. It was time to go. And God writes to us, have you ever felt alone like Jesus did that night? When you feel like that, I want you to remember something very important. You are never alone. I am always by your side. Those soldiers might have taken Jesus away from the garden, but they could never take him away from me. And there is nothing that can ever take you away from me. Remember this promise. I am always with you. From the Gospel of John. After Jesus had finished praying for his disciples, he went out with them across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who had betrayed him, also knew the place where Jesus often met. And it was there in that garden that he met with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together, with soldiers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, Who is it that you're looking for? And they answered, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replied, I am he. And Judas, who had betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, Who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you're looking for me, let these other men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. But Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword back into its sheath. I am not here to bring violence. I am to drink this cup that the Father has given me. So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish authorities arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas, who is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest for that year. And it was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. From the Passover that we celebrated last night, I wonder, where might we be in the garden? But I also wonder, when was the last time we truly felt absolutely alone? Jesus prays and falls and weeps and begs and sweats, and ultimately realize that this is why he came. The cup is not taken from him. Sometimes acceptance can be a relief. The words, not my will, but thine, were so fitting for this man. Oh, that this could have been the final piece, but it was not. For then Judas comes with the army. I can't imagine how difficult it would have been to have your betrayer be a friend. This time Judas doesn't come with questions or challenges like he often did. He doesn't carry the purse for the group. He's no longer sitting at the left hand of Jesus at that Last Supper. He does, however, come weighted down with silver and with an army. And yet Jesus is not intimidated. Even now, Jesus seeks to protect the weak, asking that those with him be allowed to go. But that's also not to be. As dark and desolate as this night is, there is more than meets the eye, but I wonder if we had been there, where might we have stood? Would we be like Judas, or like Peter, like the frightened disciples, or even the soldiers? How would we respond on such a night? Jesus is arrested, and the darkness grows. a moment and just think about all of that. The second reading, also out of the Gospel of John, Peter's denial. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard. But Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to a woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "Are you not also one of the disciples?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and soldiers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it warming themselves. Peter was also standing with them and warming himself. And those around the fire asked him, "Are you not one of this man's disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." Well, one of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a cock crowed, just like Jesus had said. Jesus knew Peter all too well. He knew of his insecurities and that they would take over when he was pressed. Peter's words rang out of the Passover feast. "I will never leave you," he said. "I will never deny you." Emphatic words when it was safe, much more difficult when challenged, particularly knowing it could cost him his life. Peter fails his Lord not once but 3 times. 3 times. And in the midst of it, the new day dawns and the rooster crows and the guilt takes over. I wonder if the same can be said of us. As the pressures mount, as the challenges come, I wonder if we could remain strong. I wonder when we have denied him, when we have denied following or even knowing him. And like Peter, we become defined not so much by the following as by the denying. And the guilt takes control. And Peter runs. And the darkness grows. Jesus is taken before the high priest and questioned. He's questioned about his disciples and his teachings. And Jesus responds, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me about my disciples or my teachings? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When Jesus had said this, one of the officials nearby struck Jesus in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" Jesus said, "If I said and have spoken wrongly, testify to what I have said that was wrong. But if I spoke rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate and the Roman headquarters. By now it was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters, so as to avoid ritual defilement and not be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." But the Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This fulfilled what Jesus said when he indicated the way in which he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Then Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews." Pilate then asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." Pilate said, "What is truth?" After Pilate had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone from you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" "No, not this man, but Barabbas." Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. He released Barabbas. Then the soldiers took Jesus and wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head and pressed it down until his head bled. And then they dressed him in a purple robe and pressed it against his bloody back. And they kept coming, mocking him and saying to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then striking him on the face. Then Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." Two questions come to mind for me as I hear these scriptures. I wonder, where would we have stood on this night? Would we have stood with the crowd or the Jewish authorities if pressed? Would we have been with Peter in the garden and denying him? But the more important question, I think, and a question that I think needs to haunt us, is the question that if we were tried, put on trial for being Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict us? And the darkness grows. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here's the man." When the chief priests and their soldiers saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him away yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." But the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered into his headquarters and again asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus remained quiet. Pilate said, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you or the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You have no power over me, unless it had been given to you from God." Pilate then went out again and tried to release Jesus, but the Jewish crowd cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now that was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And they responded, "We have no king but Caesar." Then Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. And the darkness grew. Friends, why is it that when the pressure mounts, we sometimes move into the crowd mentality, where all we want to do is be accepted? All we want to do is go with the crowd. And yet I wonder if that truly is what it means to be Christian. Everything we've done throughout this week, beginning last Sunday, talked about living sacrificially for others. So, it begs the question, are we living sacrificially for others, or are we going with the crowd? So the soldiers took Jesus And there he was, carrying the crossbeam over his shoulders by himself. He carried it down the road called the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. And he was led out along the road outside the city gates to what was called Golgotha, the place of the skull. There along the road were crosses, multitudes of crosses, some empty, some filled. It wasn't some quiet hillside. It wasn't separated from others. There weren't just 3 crosses. We want to believe that. But the fact was, Jesus was crucified like everyone else. But with one exception. As he was hung on the cross, Pilate had also had an inscription written to place on the top of the cross. It read, "The King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was so near the city. And Pilate had written it in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. The chief priests tore their robes and said to the Roman soldiers, "Do not write the King of the Jews. Maybe write, 'This man said, I am King of the Jews.'" But they responded, "What Pilate has written has been written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also then took his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, and to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture said. "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. And the darkness grows. Friends, we live in a time where power seems to grow and corrupt. We live in a time when leadership seems to be about power, not just about serving. I wonder where we might be in the midst of all of this. Jesus seemed powerless, and yet what we find is within that sacrifice was immense power. A power to transform, a power to change lives, a power to bring peace, a power unlike any other. And we now realize that that was the power of God. And it is a power that continues to live today. But it begs the question, are you willing? Am I willing? Are we willing to adhere to that kind of power, to follow that kind of sacrificial power? Like last night or yesterday, Jesus said, "This is what love looks like." Well, even today, this is what love looks like. How are we with that kind of love? Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas. And also there was Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I'm thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. From Easter Love Letters from God. High on the hillside, Jesus hung on the cross. Long, sharp nails pinned him to the wood. A crown of spiky thorns dug deep into his forehead. Jesus was ready to die, but he was still afraid. He looked down and could see his mother crying. He could hear the soldiers laughing at him. He could feel the sharp nails through his hands and his feet, and Jesus cried out. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He felt alone, all alone. Where was his Father now? Then the sun disappeared behind a huge gray cloud. Cold crept in. Darkness covered the world. Jesus closed his eyes. He bowed his head. He took one last breath. And at 3:00 in the afternoon, in that cold and that darkness, Jesus died. The wind howled, the whole earth trembled, the rocks shattered, the hills quaked, and the mighty curtain in the temple split in two. But Jesus was still. It was finished. And God writes, "Shall I tell you a secret? When Jesus was crying on the cross, I was crying too. When those nails were hurting Jesus, I was hurting. When Jesus felt all alone, I felt all alone. And when my son died, part of me died. But guess what? Death does not win in this story. Life wins. Love wins. My promise to Jesus was that nothing could separate him from my love. And that is the promise that I give to you. I love you. From God. Do we believe that death is the end? Do we believe that death is simply darkness overcoming light? Do we believe that there might be a God who loves us so much that God will take us back to God's self even after we die? Do we believe that Jesus might have been an example of that? It begs the question, what do we believe? And can we find hope in the midst of death? And the darkness grows. After all of these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission. So Joseph and a few others came and removed the body. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it in linen cloths that were covered with spices, which was according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now just across the road there was a garden, and in that garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so because of it, and because this was the Jewish day of preparation, and the tomb was nearby, that is where they laid Jesus. I'm not sure there has ever been a more impactful moment in my life of standing there looking over the road just under the rock outcropping called the Place of the Skull. And imagining that road lined with crosses and Jesus being on one of those. But the place where we were able to look down on that road, just behind us was a garden. And in that garden was a tomb. And in front of that tomb was a stone. And there was a power there. A power unlike anything I've ever felt. There was a peace there, unlike any peace I've ever felt. And sitting there with that group with whom I think we'd all become so close, we shared communion. We were able to go into the tomb, each one, basically one at a time. And I remember our own Peter placing a cross against the stone and being overcome with emotion. I'm not sure that if we're not overcome by emotion on this day, if we would ever be overcome by emotion as a Christian disciple on any day. I think we've all lost loved ones. And yeah, that's a different kind of being overcome. But there's a spirit of lostness that we need to feel on this day. A wondering of what death is or might bring. And it really is what this day is all about. Because the darkness grows. From the book. Jesus had died, and Joseph and Nicodemus were sad. They carefully took Jesus' body down from the cross. They cleaned him. They wrapped his body in strips of white linen and carried him to a quiet cave on the hillside and in a garden. They gently laid Jesus down inside the cave. And then they said goodbye. Before they left, they rolled a big stone over the entrance. And outside the cave were 2 guards who kept watch. The big heavy stone was sealed in place. And it was sealed in place for 3 whole days. And all was still. But inside the quiet cave, God was working. If you tried to peek inside, you couldn't see anything. If you stood outside and put your ear to the big stone, you couldn't hear anything. If you tried to imagine what was happening, you couldn't. But inside, God was doing something utterly amazing. Something only God could do. Jesus had died, and the world held its breath. And I'm going to wait to read this letter from God on Easter morning, and then we'll hear the rest of the story. But hear this scripture as we bring this to a close. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. And he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And so, one from whom others hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken and struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his bruises and his cuts, we are healed. All like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquities of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted. Yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. It is finished. Go in peace.